Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying healthy. Um, Today, we're going to talk about organic fertilizers. Um, it's a pretty big, diverse field. It's interesting. I'm going to cover a lot of stuff today, so bear with me. Of course, you can pause anytime and go back and listen to it again, which may be more helpful than in a class. I don't know. Um, Anyways, obviously, organic fertilizers are important for organic farming. It's a requirement. You cannot use conventional fertilizers in organic farms. It's a fact. Organic is definitely becoming more mainstream. Consumers are demanding it. There's more and more of it around. Uh, you can definitely get a higher price for your produce. So farmers are business people. If they can make more money doing something, they're going to do it that way because they've got to keep the bank happy. There are definitely some challenges with organic fertilizer. We're going to get into that a little bit. Let's dig into it. Um, Organic production requires certification, and certification is a murky industry. I've just got a smattering over here of different organizations that are around that will certify organic farming. It is very confusing for organic farmers, and a lot of organic farmers have opted to not even certify. They just say, look, I'm organic, take it or leave it. Um, there certainly are costs associated with certifying. You have to pay for annual or quarterly inspections to maintain your certification. So the least stringent of all these is USDA. Uh, the rules for being organic under that are pretty slack. I have a picture here of a farm in Bangladesh because I wanted to point out that um, a lot of countries are organic and have been for a very long time by necessity. They don't have access to synthetic fertilizers and they're just doing the best they can with what they've got. So, in a sense, maybe a lot of them have things figured out. But let's see what we've got here. One thing I want to clarify is what is organic versus what I call inorganic. I don't want to get too lost here. It's not supposed to be too complicated, but basically anything that has carbon, these C's are carbons, any molecule that has carbon in it is considered an organic molecule. So that's where this term came from, organic versus inorganic. It's been a little bit confusing for people. Organic fertilizers have carbon in them, where synthetic or conventional or what I'm going to call inorganic fertilizers have no carbon. There's no C's here. There's oxygen, and the K is a potassium. So these are salts that we would feed to plants. These are not organic molecules. They are salts that we mine from the ground or make from petroleum. So what is important to understand is that plants absorb inorganic. Okay, so plants don't absorb organic compounds, not readily, that is, which means we're left with just these types of molecules that plants can feed on, right? Magnesium, ammonium, nitrate, potassium, calcium, phosphate, and sulfate. Um, right? It doesn't mean that organic fertilizers do not contain inorganic molecules, right? But let's see what happens here. So organic fertilizers are typically derived from dead plants and animals. So they're in some form of decay. And that is what they are, right? So they're composed of some sort of a rotting plant or animal. And inside that, there is bacteria, fungi, all the stuff we talked about from composting, protozoa to eat the bacteria, and worms and all that stuff, basically to release all the nutrients that we know the plants need. This is a really interesting picture that helps you to see what happens in the soil with respect to nitrogen. Um, what I want you to get from this is that, let's say there's a plant growing up here and it drops some leaves and they begin to compost and rot. Decomposers begin to work on the material and release nutrients, right? Those nutrients are then broken down by bacteria. We call these nitrifying bacteria. And there's multiple stages where ultimately they produce nitrates, which then the plant can use again. This is when I talked about how tropical jungles are productive because they're cycling their nitrogen rapidly in the soil. But when we clear it off and then plant a crop, we are not producing a cycle because we harvest the entire plant, take it away, we're breaking the cycle. So those soils become very deficient quickly. You'll notice that there is a branch here where bacteria can denitrify and lose it to the atmosphere. That typically happens when soils are too wet. So if you're growing wet all the time, a lot of your nitrogen actually gets converted to nitrogen gas and evaporates from the soil and you lose it. So it's important to keep the correct moisture levels when you're growing crops. That's why typically plants that are really wet go yellow, because even if you're providing nitrogen, it's quickly being converted back to nitrogen gas and evaporating from the soil. So there are fancy circles highlighting what I just talked about. Why feed organically? So why would we feed organically, right? So one of the things that we like to talk about is that it's a slow release fertilizer. That means it takes time. It takes time to break down, time to form those inorganic elements that come out of it when the bacteria do their heavy lifting work. It can also reduce leaching, right? So when we just add straight salts to soil, they can wash out the bottom. Whereas organic tends to be stuck in the soil because it's releasing slowly. It doesn't mean that there's no leaching, but it can definitely be reduced. Organic fertilizer will also improve the biology because you're putting food in the soil that feeds organisms. So you have a higher population of beneficial bacteria. Your soil is then going to become more productive, and also encourages beneficial organisms that might actually prevent disease, like fungi that will protect your roots, or bacteria that will outcompete nutrients for bad bacteria that might infect your roots as well. Other advantages of organic fertilizers. So we know that they improve the organic content because we're adding organic matter, which also means our cation exchange capacity improves. So our soil can hold more nutrients. It will also increase the water holding capacity, improves soil structure. So that means reduces soil erosion in the spring if you've got organic matter helping to bind the material. We already talked about greater microbial activity, which means more improved conversion of nutrients, and reduced leach, right? So because the nutrients are tied up in the organic matter that's stuck in the soil, in the spring rains, it may not run away as salts as easily. And lastly, I want to talk about mycorrhizae a little bit. Mycorrhizae are a type of fungi that are beneficial. They're a fungus that infects roots by growing into them. They actually fuse with the roots, grow into the cells, and have a very tight connection with their cellular level of basically the phloem where the sugars are. So what happens then is the plant will give sugars to the fungus, right? And you're like, well, why is that? Maybe it's a parasite. Well, not really. It's a mutually beneficial relationship, right? So plants can only really give sugar. That's the only thing they have to offer. And the fungus takes the sugar in exchange for giving the plant water and nutrients. And you might say to what's the benefit to the plant, right? So they get some nutrients. Well, typically, if you have a root ball for a tree, let's say it encompasses a 10-meter wide span, with a mycorrhizal association, you could probably increase that collection area to 30 meters. That's how much further the fungus will reach to acquire more nutrients and more water, right? So typically plants that have mycorrhizal associations, that's this, are more drought tolerant and require fewer nutrients. So they typically, for example, phosphorus, which is a typically difficult one to get, plants with mycorrhizal associations are less prone to phosphorus deficiencies. Basically, you go anywhere in the forest and you look at what's going on, you dig a shovel into the ground, almost every plant has a fungal association, like a mycorrhizae. That's what makes the forest so productive. You don't have little elves running around spreading fertilizer to keep everything productive. You have a very, very efficient system that's benefiting from all sorts of interactions. This is just a diagram showing a root cell and the hyphae extending out from the root. In here is these tight joints where the fungus interacts with the root. taking away sugar and delivering water and phosphorus. On the top here is a picture of grass or turf that has a mycorrhizae associated and one that does not. And the plant is much healthier with the mycorrhizal association. So these are definitely very, very helpful associations. There are some challenges though, right? That means that we cannot use fungicides. So a lot of times people use fungicides actually kill the mycorrhizae and ruin that association, which limits the crop's ability to collect nutrients and water, which means it relies more on you to provide nutrients and water. Okay, let's go back to organic fertilizers. They increase organic matter and cation exchange capacity. They increase water holding capacity. They improve soil structure, which means less erosion. We get better aeration, increased microbial activity, and organic fertilizers will leach somewhat less than conventional. And then, of course, they're also, because we're dealing with organic, it's a lot easier to grow fungal populations in the soil. Disadvantages. Let's be honest, there are some. They require microbial activity to break them down, right? So just like in our composting lesson, if you don't have the bacteria, if you don't grow the bacteria, you're not going to get composting. So with organic fertilizers, if you're not growing the bacteria, then you don't get nutrient conversion. Now that has some implications, right? One of the more obvious implications is from a food safety perspective, right? Where we're trying to control the growth of bacteria, especially ones that are dangerous. And so we don't use any kind of soil sterilizers. Say, for example, you're doing field production of lettuce. You might get bacteria in the field that you just can't get rid of without risking killing off the bacteria that are mineralizing all your nutrients. Or in a hydroponic organic setting, like we're doing at the college, where we're growing cucumbers in hydroponic conditions with organic fertilizers and media, we can't add anything to sterilize the water because it will kill our bacteria and then reduce the rate of nutrient mineralization. So that means you need the correct temperature, pH, and moisture levels all the time, and you're focusing more on the bacteria in the soil than you are on the plant. So yes, we need mineralization to break down the organic matter into nutrients, and that can be slow, right? That's maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing. Some organic fertilizers are faster than others. Unfortunately, a lot of organic fertilizers are slow. And for some crops that grow very quickly, getting the nutrients out fast enough can be a real challenge. And that's where you need to pay close attention to what fertilizers you choose and their rate of mineralization. Yes, and so it's kind of related to the speed. Could be that nutrients may not readily be available when plants need them. This comes from mixing different fertilizers. So say you take a slow organic fertilizer and a fast one. Let's say the fast one releases nitrogen and the slow one releases potassium. That means that initially your plant's going to have lots of nitrogen but not have sufficient potassium until finally that nutrient starts to release. So you may exhibit potassium symptoms early on in your crop. So designing an organic fertilizer system requires careful selection. FYI, in our folder this week, I have links to organic fertilizer spreadsheets and lists which discuss their rate of degradation or mineralization. So if you really want to take this seriously, you got to pay attention to that kind of information. Okay, let's summarize where we are so far. We've added cation exchange capacity and water holding capacity. We need bacteria to mineralize, right? So we have to have good conditions in the soil. It is a slow release. The plant response is not always understood. We need to consider the source, right? And why are we even talking about this? Well, because probably a lot of organic agriculture is in the future. Going back to this disadvantages, microbial activity, right? Mineralization, I talked about it taking time. It is also temperature related. So that's another thing to keep in mind, right? So in the cool spring conditions, soils are obviously cold and bacteria is moving around more slowly, and so mineralization takes even longer. So you definitely need to be on top of that, right? So faster in warm weather, slower in cool weather. Leaching, Again, maybe, maybe not. Hard to say. But water will wash just about anything out of the soil. I know, for example, manure, we know leaches into rivers, and not only do we get nitrogen loading, but we get E. coli loading from leaching. Let's look at some sources of fertilizers. There's obviously manure, which is a high nitrogen content, high enough that sometimes it can burn. Remember, manure is not composted. Then there's compost, which is low in nitrogen, right, and often needs supplementation. Blood meal is an example of a high nitrogen. This is a rapidly breaking down one, so it releases nutrients quick. Again, you can burn a crop with too much nitrogen with those. Feather meal, which is very slow and has the risk of heavy metals. Soybean meal is slow but is toxic to some seedlings. Be very careful using it on young plants. Fish emulsion is all over the map. It really depends on how it's prepared, who made it, what fish. It is definitely prone to leaching, but whether it's fast or slow is really variable. Alfalfa meal is a rapid release type organic fertilizer, which can get very hot, so you want to keep it away from directly on top of your roots. And then lastly, we're going to look at bat guano, which is the highest in nitrogen and the most available, but it is also a possible nutrient burn one, so you got to use it in small quantities. And then seaweed kelp, which is a real promising one for nitrogen and potassium. Before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about lime, because at the end of the day, you'll see why lime is important. There are three kinds of lime. There's calcium carbonate, right, which is basically just calcium. There's gypsum, which is sulfur and calcium. And then there's what's called dolomitic lime, which has both calcium and magnesium in it. Calcium is a very difficult nutrient to get in organic fertilizer programs, as is magnesium. And so oftentimes organic fertilizer programs rely heavily on lime. Now, technically, lime is mined from the ground as a mineral. I mean, it's very abundant on the planet, but you know, in the strictest of terms, really it shouldn't be used in an organic program. But almost everyone who doesn't have enough lime in their soil really struggles to get proper calcium nutrition. So keep that in mind as we go through this bunch of fertilizers. Looking at a typical mix here, this is a complete organic fertilizer mix. It's got kelp meal in here, there's bone meal in here, there's dolomitic lime, I just mentioned that, there's soybean meal, and then there's agricultural lime. So there's two bits of lime. This has got calcium carbonate and gypsum in it. So there's your calcium's coming from these two, and then your NPK is coming from here, and iron also is in your blood meal, so you get your iron from that. Let's look at these. So blood meal, dried powdered blood from slaughterhouses, very high in nitrogen because there's a lot of protein in it. There's the percentages. Look, 13.1.6. So basically, it's essentially all nitrogen. It has some trace elements, particularly iron, which is very helpful for a lot of organic programs. We use this in our cucumbers at the college to help keep the leaves green enough to compete with our conventional. Fish emulsion. This is partially decomposed, pulverized fish, usually large schools of very small fish that are not typically harvested. The most common is something called a Manhattan fish. Very high in nitrogen, or Manhattan, sorry. Usually the fish are pressed for the oils, and then the oils are extracted and sold as food supplements, like, what is it, the beta something oils, whatever those healthy ones are. Anyways, that industry has a waste product, and that's the fish parts that are left after pressing. So typically phosphoric acid is added to the fish meal to help break it down and preserve it. The bonus being that phosphoric acid is high in phosphorus, which means that the plants get the phosphorus that they need, which is another difficult nutrient to get. So fish meal is often another way of finding a way to put phosphorus into your nutrient program. Is it organic? Well, that's a tough question. Phosphoric acid is not made by organic means, but these things are often buried 2-3 steps in the process of making the fertilizer, so it's less obvious. Manure, 1-1-1. You know, is there a lot of fertilizer? No, but it's readily available. Um, Typically, if it's composted, there's not much left. And a lot of the nutrients in manure are released over time, right? So we're talking about decomposers doing their work. So you add the manure to your field, there's an initial shot of nitrogen, but the rest of the nutrients start to come out as it breaks down over the season. Feather meal, this is a tricky one. Feather meal is made from chickens that have gone to the slaughter. Feathers are modified fingernails. So you and I have fingernails and we have hair. It's all made from the same molecule called keratin. Basically, they shred the feathers and they have keratin, and that eventually is broken down by bacteria to release the nitrogen that's in the protein. Um, One of the problems I have with this fertilizer is that we don't know how the chickens were grown. Chickens in chicken farms are usually dusted with anti-miticides to keep them healthy. They are fed all kinds of things, and the dust gets in their feathers, and it's not easy to clean. So whatever is in there is in your feather meal. And another problem is that human physiology shared by chickens, we have livers that detoxify things we eat, but heavy metals we're not able to process those. So typically we store them in our fingernails and our hair. If you've ever watched CSI and they talk about looking at hair analysis, they can see where someone's from and their diet by looking at the metals in their hair and their fingernails. So if we have a feather which is potentially concentrating heavy metals, there's a health risk for long-term use in your soil. So that's another one to be careful with. Alfalfa meal. This is a very good fertilizer. It's well balanced. You see here 2.511. We actually use this on our organic cucumbers at the college. It does need bacteria to mineralize, right? Of course. The one question you might have is where and how is the alfalfa grown? Some farmers spray alfalfa, some treat their fields with herbicides between crops. It really depends, but there are probably more and more alfalfa growers out there that are not using as many chemicals. The other thing is that there is transgenic alfalfa, which means GMO. So what's in there, I don't know. Personally, I'm okay with it all, but maybe not all of you are. Soybean meal. This is high in nitrogen. Look here, 712. It's fairly high. High enough that it can burn a crop if over applied. There's lots of examples on where soybean meal has proven to be inhibitory to seedlings germinating, particularly lettuce and turnips. So if you're starting your garden material, you want to avoid soybean meal for the seedlings. Then, of course, just like alfalfa, there's questions about where did the soybean come from? How was it grown? And a lot of soybean is genetically modified. So keep an eye on that if you're concerned. Again, I'm not, but you know, in the organic world, there's a full spectrum of where their expectations are. Cottonseed meal. Cottonseed meal is a very useful organic fertilizer, primarily because it will acidify your soil. Remember, trying to keep your micronutrients available means keeping the pH below 7. With a lot of organic fertilizers, we don't have much control over soil pH. So a lot of people growing crops that need the soil slightly more acidic rely heavily on these types of nutrients. For example, say you want to grow organic blueberries. You definitely need to use cottonseed meal to keep the soil acidic enough for the blueberries to grow properly. It is slow, so that means you need some planning. Get it into the crop, into the soil early on, and at the right position relative to the roots. As far as modern technology and organic fertilizer, there's a lot of potential for algae meal. These are algae ponds up here where they're feeding wastewater into ponds that recirculate and they grow algae. And the algae take the nutrients out of the wastewater, and then you filter out the algae and press them to make meal. There's actually two outputs. One of the other outputs is oil. You've probably heard of biodiesel, right? So there's a lot of interest in producing oil from algae using human and agricultural waste. And then the byproduct from pressing it is the meal, which we can use as a great fertilizer. Look at that, 731, not bad. This is actually a greenhouse doing a proof of concept accelerated algae growth in glass plates, trying to see if they can process waste in cities more quickly. I think there's a really interesting future for this as far as fuel, energy, carbon capture, and agricultural output. There's really no downsides to this. And what's encouraging is we've been doing algae trials in Arizona and Texas for many, many years now. So there's a lot of expertise. What we need is for the oil price to go so expensive that these other ideas become much more viable. And of course, right now, that's certainly not the case with oil being below $30 a barrel. Lastly, fairly new is seaweed kelp. Well, actually, new and not new. Kelp has been around for a very long time. If you know anyone who lives in the Maritimes, historically, people who had very little money could actually just go down to the beach and gather kelp and sell it as a fertilizer ingredient. And they were paid by the pound. It was not a glamorous job, and people only did it if they really had to, but kelp has been around for a long time. What's really interesting about it is it's actually higher in potassium than the other nutrients, which makes it a very useful fertilizer for bumping potassium up, especially for finishing those veggie crops. It's in the middle between rapid and slow, so it's a moderate release rate. The only risk associated is maybe some sodium if it's not properly washed before it's ground and turned into powder. But the industry is pretty good at washing it off and making it safe for crops. Guano, bird and bat droppings, very high in nitrogen, and it releases very quickly. There's very little work for bacteria to do to release the nitrogen. Guano was actually the world's major source of nitrogen for agriculture for a very long time. There's an interesting history about this. If you go back to the 1800s, off the coast of Peru, there are a bunch of islands. These are their names, if it matters to you. Chinchas, Belastras, Lobos, Maccabi, and Guanape Islands. Anyways, these are islands that are far enough out to sea that there's no real predators on them. They're rocky, but if you look carefully, they look like they're actually rock, but most of it is actually bird dung. The stuff is literally meters thick because of millions of years of birds flying there, landing to rest and pooping and then leaving. And they left lots and lots of bird dung on the island. And in the 1800s, these are some pictures of ramparts. Just picture your wooden pirate ship type boat parking up against the island. They literally hacked pieces of the island apart and put it in their cargo and shipped it around the world to sell to countries for their farmers. At one time, it was the most lucrative trade that could be put in ships, more so than opium. But when we figured out how to make fertilizers, which was in the 1900s, this industry started to fall apart. But there are still ramparts on the islands if you happen to go by in a boat. Actually, and of course, organic growing is producing a new need for the guano because people are looking for nitrogen, and that's a quick way to get it. So there's a go. They're rocky islands with very little rainfall, so the bird poop doesn't wash away. And then there's limited predators, which means millions of birds land there all the time. And that adds up into high, thick piles of bird dung. So why is this forest productive? It's organic. What's going on? Well, we know there's nutrient cycling happening. Nothing's wasted. It's decomposed by bacteria and reused again. We know now that there's also fungi in here. It's hard to write with a mouse. That are helping to distribute those nutrients efficiently between all the plants and keep it productive. In an ideal world, this is how we would farm, but very difficult to maintain high productivity. If you're at all interested in more organic stuff, I've got some links here. This is the Guelph Organic Conference, and then this is a website to an organization called Woofing, where you click on it and you can find organic farms where there are opportunities to work. Usually they're not paying positions, but you get food and lodging covered. It's a fantastic way to go see the world. There's woofing opportunities all over the place. Australia, New Zealand, South America, Asia, all over North America. If you're looking for something to do this summer and you don't have a job yet, maybe. Now, you won't make much money, but you won't starve. So try woofing.